Good evening, my name is Patty Jensen. I'm one of the members of the planning team that brought this exhibit here and was involved in the programs, one of which you're attending tonight. I just want to thank you all for coming. We're just so excited that you're here, that you made this choice to be here with your time tonight and to be interested in your community and hopefully learn some things. When we thought about bringing Untold the Red Line to Upper Northwest DC, we had several goals. One, of course, is we wanted to educate people. Another was that we wanted to encourage dialogue and on challenging issues. Yet another was to understand our history. And in light of that, envision ways forward together. So we put together these series of programs to support those objectives, to learn more about specific histories and neighborhoods, and to provide a place where our community could engage in discussions that enhance understanding and are a catalyst for envisioning the future. Tonight, Bob Ward will be exploring the history of Cleveland Park. We all have different perceptions and interpretation of history in light of where we live and grew up, our racial ethnicity, experiences, etc. And we have very different thoughts about what our history means for who we are and what we want to become individually and as a community. Tonight, after Bob's presentation, we're going to invite discussion. How does this history speak to you? How does it impact the way you see our community? And what does it mean for the future? The invitation is for us to exchange ideas and information. Hopefully to do a little more listening than talking, and to create an environment where we can freely and respectfully express ourselves. To create that environment, I invite you to follow these guidelines, which I put up here. One is to listen, for understanding, not to debate. A challenge for me always. The second is to acknowledge that we all come with unique experience and values. The third is to allow everyone to speak for themselves, not on behalf of our group. Use I statements. You're in charge of your experience. Assume good intention, but acknowledge impact. And notice how much you are talking. Wait, why am I talking? Why am I not talking? Hopefully, remain non-judgmental in language and tone, stay present and focused, and hold your opinions lightly. That sometimes allows a new truth to enter in. With that, I want to shift to the informative presentation at hand and introduce Bob Ward. Bob is a 20-year resident of Cleveland Park, where he's been active in his community. He served as president of the Cleveland Park Club, was active in bringing the Main Street program to the neighborhood, and is founder of Cleveland Park Smart Growth, which advocates for a more walkable, sustainable, and equitable community. He and his family live on Macomb Street, just across from the library. Professionally, he is a public opinion research firm servicing nonprofits, advocacy groups, and corporations. I'd also like to add that he was an active member of our community advisory group and has been generous with his time, sharing information and ideas for programs, including putting his time into giving this program that would be of interest to the community. And we are very grateful for that. And with that, we turn it over to Bob.
Thank you all for coming. It's a lot of a crowd. I want to title this talk, The Untold History of Cleveland Park. And I want to start by saying that Cleveland Park is an awesome place. My wife and I chose to move here 20 years ago for its mix of urbanity, proximity to the park. We've raised our family here. The residents are engaged, smart, and passionate. And so this look back on the area's history is done from admiration for a place that I call home. So when Cleveland Park was designated as a historic district in 1987, one of the main criteria was its founding by an enlightened and benevolent developer, a real estate developer, who fostered pride in his community. And so what do we mean by that? And we read through, there was horse stables just here on Macomb Street behind my neighbor's house, where you could ride your horse, park it there, and then get the streetcar. There was a heated lodge right where we are tonight, which was the waiting place for the streetcar. Not all of the streets followed a grid. They followed curvilinear pathways of the topography. And there was, beautiful, unique architect-designed homes. Cleveland Park was and is a very beautiful neighborhood with lots of great amenities. In its beginning, Cleveland Park was called the Queen of the Washington Suburbs. In fact, there is the lodge that was right here on Connecticut Avenue before it burned down in 1911. We have books and brochures and history about our neighborhood, all recounting a very serendipitous evolution into a charming village within the city. But our neighborhood is also not very diverse. It's overwhelmingly white. It was and continues to be. It's prohibitively expensive, increasingly so for many first-time home buyers and young families. And many longer-term residents, and I would include myself in this category, would say their younger selves wouldn't be able to move into this neighborhood today. It's too expensive. And we just take a look at the data in terms of current demographics. It's just under 80% white, Cleveland Park. We define that by Census Tract 6, compared to 36% for the district overall. And if we look at home prices for single-family homes in Cleveland Park, the average price is 120% more than the average price for a single-family home district-wide. It's currently coming in, according to Zillow, $1.6 million. So it is a difficult place to call home for many people. And as I mentioned, we chose to move here 20 years ago, and let's be honest, the issue of equity and exclusivity are not things I gave a lot of thought to when I moved here. And frankly, in the years after. This was not something that was on my radar. And so I guess the question is, why focus on this subject now? And for me, a couple things happened over the last several years, probably now 5 years. The first was my exposure to Richard Rothstein's work. He wrote the book, The Color of Law, but there's a great 17-minute video. And if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend it. The book is long, and it is very complete. But the 17-minute video is really good. And it's super easy to find. It's called segregatedbydesign.com, and I encourage everyone to watch it. And it goes through in a very concise way how the government played an unavoidable role in segregating America in all sorts of ways. And that's really what the subject of Undesign the Red Line is about, what's been happening over the course of the last century, and how generations of wealth were lost for Black families who couldn't find home ownership because of the policies of the government. And it was a wake-up call. And then almost immediately after my being exposed to that, the George Floyd situation happened, the murder happened in Minnesota. And it was a stark reminder that state-sanctioned racism is not gone away. And it's still among us, and we have to be more proactive in taking an anti-racist approach to how we view things. So that was my wake-up call and got me started down this path. So around this time, there's been a number of folks doing really good work in this space locally. There's a historian, Neil Flanagan, who's actually writing a book right now, but has written a bunch of pieces, one famously about the Reno City story and how the thriving black community up in Tenleytown area was removed by the government to make way for the white-only schools that are up there in Deal and now Jackson Reed. Matt Fruin, before he became a counselor, was doing work with Wynn on talking about this subject. The historic Chevy Chase DC and ANC 3-4G up in the Chevy Chase area have done great work looking into the sort of segregationist past of their own community. And so I got sort of nipped with this history bug. When I ran the Cleveland Park Club, I really got into its history, and I would look for like articles in the past about people who founded the club, and I was just very interested in it. So I'm like, oh, start there. And I just started doing newspaper searches about our neighborhood. And it didn't take long to find, just how overtly this place was advertised. So Connecticut Avenue Highlands is Cleveland Park, basically from Ordway Street over to Rodman. And that was one of the three developments that really made up what is now Cleveland Park. But they advertised themselves as being very restricted. Woodley Park, we have the most restricted neighborhood in Washington. And so it just sort of popped out at you that this is how the neighborhood is billing itself. It wasn't overtly racist. And there were advertisements for neighborhoods that were absolutely overtly racist. Here it was more economically driven. If we look at some of these things, and I'll read this, talking about the Connecticut Avenue Highlands and why you should move here. Persons owning fine homes and having shanties built in their immediate neighborhoods, to say nothing of the undesirable persons who frequently occupy them, can appreciate the force of our building restriction clause. And so, in the deeds to all the homes that were in that development and many others around this area, there were restrictions that you had to build a house that had a minimum cost. And so it prevented lower quality or cheaper housing to be built in this area. Take an example of a street that's just right up, a house right up the street, and I'm just using this because this is the one I had. These are all over the neighborhood, so not picking on this house, but in the deed, it says that there shall not be a house erected that costs less than $4,000. And so this is the beginning of the 20th century. That was a tidy sum for the cost of building a house that we're selling for $6,000, $8,000, or $10,000. And you have the land and everything else, development profit to factor in there. So at the time, it was an effective restriction to make sure that cheaper houses were not being produced. This was a Sherman cottage. So John Sherman was the developer of the Cleveland Park Company, one of the other three development firms that built the neighborhood. But then later, in the 20s, late teens, we start seeing the use of explicitly racially restrictive covenants in the property deeds. There's a great project called Mapping Segregation that when I started this work, I went and looked at. And I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know how it was sourced, the data. And I looked and I'm like, wow, there's only like 3 houses in Cleveland Park that have racially restricted deeds. Like, that's pretty awesome. How do we do so well? And then I started doing my own research, looking into the deeds. And you could do that online. It only goes back to 1922, so anything before that we don't have access to. So there's definitely spots. But what I found is there was a lot of deeds that were racially restricted in Washington, in Cleveland Park. And so here, just zoom in, read the language in black and white. Subject to further covenants that said lot shall never be rented, leased, sold, transferred, or conveyed unto any Negro or colored person or any person of Negro extraction. Okay? This was a house right up the street here on Combe Street. And it was, you know, to read that is jarring, to say the least. This house was built by Harry Kite, who was the developer who built my house, prolific developer in DC. They were so prolific, there was property on Ordway Street that was owned by the Cleveland Park Congregational Church that also had racially restricted covenants in it. Now, I will say, this was 100 years ago, okay? And the Cleveland Park Congregational Church is among those who are doing really great work on this issue, on exploring the history of the past. But I use this as an example that even churches have racially restricted covenants on their land in Cleveland Park. So this is the map that I produced of the research of the deeds that I could find. And what you can see is this area here, where they were very prolific. This was called the Richmond Park development, and it was developed last of the 3 developments. The other one was the Connecticut Avenue Highlands, which was over here, which was largely restricted by price. And then this was the Cleveland Park companies mostly developed this land, and also had price restrictions. And then these 2 houses are the ones by Harry Kite on Combe Street that came a bit later, that had the racial restrictions. We had 2 brothers who came from a real estate family. They grew up on Highland Place, then called Highland Avenue. Got into the family real estate business. They were William and Allison Miller.
WC and
yes,
AM.
Miller. Anyhow, the real estate company still exists, but they grew up at St. Albans High School. They lived in the neighborhood. They and their sister, Agnes, were instrumental in forming the Cleveland Park Club. And they built houses here in the neighborhood. It was their first place where they started doing development. And they have houses that they built here where they put racially restricted covenants in the houses they built. They went on to build whole neighborhoods. Wesley Heights was built by the Miller brothers, and they were all had restrictive covenants on it. This one, not only did it have restrictions for persons of the Negro race or blood, but also persons of the Semitic race, blood, or origin, including Jews, Hebrews, Armenians, Persians, and Syrians. So they were quite comprehensive. And they did this, and not only did they do this when it was legal to do, this is from the DC Policy Center, or did some research on the Miller brothers and racially restrictive covenants. They were putting racially restrictive covenants in after 1948, when the Supreme Court said they were unenforceable. So they built Spring Valley and included the racial covenants in Spring Valley. And that was after the Supreme Court said they were unenforceable, but they thought it was important to put in there, hoping to be a discouragement. We had apartment buildings up and down Connecticut Avenue that came later in the 20s. Kennedy Warren is one of them. It was built in the late 20s. And just to highlight sort of, it applied to apartment buildings as well. And in their advertisement, to this end, it's necessary that the management observe the highest standards in the selection of tenants who will aid in maintaining the character of the property. So it was not just the purchase or rental of single-family homes. It included some of the nicer apartment buildings as well. The next piece of research I conducted was to look at the census enumeration pages to see who lived in our neighborhood and what the composition looked like. And the latest that I had, the 1950 census is now out. I haven't delved into that. But I did have the 1940 census. And you can go house to house, block by block, looking at who lived there and some basic characteristics of who they are. And so I did that for Cleveland Park. And the one thing I found was that there are no black homeowners in Cleveland Park in the 1940 census. 0. There were black people living in Cleveland Park in 1940, and they were all domestic servants. So you can see this house right up here on Ross Place. You have the Jensen family, the head of household Willard and his wife Catherine, 2 daughters, and then Marion Dorsey, female Negro, age 32. So when we look at population of blacks in this area from the census records, and it says 3%, they were largely people who were here because of their employment. Didn't only apply to single family homes. Parkway, that building right there, and I did this for all the apartment buildings in the area, and it was basically the same thing. The only black people who lived in the apartment buildings in 1940 were the people who worked there, the janitor and housekeeper. Woodley Park Towers had a few more. There was an elevator. There was a family, but they all had, the census enumerators what their jobs were, and the jobs were all related to running of the building. There was no one I could find anywhere that was black in any of the apartment buildings in Cleveland Park that was there other than for their employment to service the building. Let's look at the data. It's fascinating. DC has changed a lot over time. And so going back, we think of DC as a very, the woke chocolate city, which is another good one to read, but as being, black majority. It no longer is, but it was, and certainly at the height in the 1970s, it was, pull up what these, so in the 1970s, it was 71% black. That was the peak, and then it has gone down since then. But back in 1930 and 1940, we weren't over 30% black district-wide. But here we look at, and this isn't just Cleveland Park, this is what we call Rock Creek West, it's sort of west of the park, DC. It was started out as 4% black in 1930, and then this is around the same time that Reno City was removed. Also the houses up in Broad Branch that were evicted to make way for Lafayette, the white Lafayette Elementary School. We start seeing the black percentage go down in this part of the city while it was shooting up in the rest. So the city grew, this part of DC grew. There was an explosion around the time of the war, but as black population was going up citywide, it was going down here. It was very small, but it was going down even more here. So the exclusions that were put in, or the policies of exclusion, were extremely effective. Later in the 1920s, as I mentioned, we saw apartments being built on Connecticut Avenue. They were also built on our side streets. Beautiful little apartment building right up the street here on Combe Street. We've got some apartment buildings over on 29th. Porter Street obviously has lots of little apartment buildings and co-ops. The Citizens Association of the time, Cleveland Park Citizens Association and Connecticut Avenue Citizens Association, were instrumental in getting the DC Zoning Commission to make it illegal to build apartment buildings in these areas. And that we were the thing that kicked it off. So the zoning code had just come to DC in 1920. And they soon realized that without any further restrictions, there would be apartments near single-family homes, and the folks in Cleveland Park did not like that. And so they got the zoning commission to create a restricted residential area, which basically meant there could only be single-family homes built there and not apartments. So we have all these lovely examples of apartments built on our side streets that are really sort of house size, maybe slightly larger, that would be illegal to build today, and that holds today. As one of my friends says, every street in DC should have the good fortune to be like Porter Street, and so that's something I think about. As the population surged, the other thing that was interesting going through the census records is there were people renting rooms all over the place. And this is the map where I found lodgers. And so this house I pull up here on Combe Street, had the head of household, his wife, and then 3 unrelated lodgers. And so it just goes to show you, and this was, all these dots represent some house that had someone living there who was as their identity, not, you know, wife, son, daughter, whatever, but lodger. We made room for people here when housing was scarce. The redlining, which is obviously part of the undesigned red line, and this map is out there. I hope everyone has spent some time with that exhibit. If you haven't, do so. It's here through July 11th. But what I wanted to call out was some of the definitions. This map was produced by the Federal Housing Administration. So the government made this map, and it graded it. And Cleveland Park, or this area, are graded A and B. Cleveland Park specifically is graded B, not graded A, probably because we had so many apartment buildings, and you know what that means. But the B class, these areas are composed of the newer subdivisions, of better class of homes, representing a high degree of protection from adverse influences. On the map, I've highlighted the H graded areas. They are east in DC. What is H? H is, this is the government writing this, the property and residential areas for this designation represents the Negro developments and the lowest grade of residential area in the Washington metropolitan area. The only possible future for properties in these areas is that the present scattered structures may be raised and new planned subdivisions instituted in their place. Government, hard work. Not specifically related to Cleveland Park, but this book is called Segregation in Washington. It was produced in the late 1940s by Kennesaw Mountain Landis, not the baseball commissioner, but his nephew, wrote this book, and it's fascinating. I pulled this, I found it. I mentioned historian Neil Flanagan. He wrote this article for Greater Washington back in 2015. But it just goes through and shows sort of like the systematic ways, not just government, but the system stacked against Black people owning homes and building home wealth. But this one quote from the Washington Real Estate Board Code of Ethics from 1948, no property in a white section should ever be sold, rented, or advertised or offered to colored people. In case of doubt, advice from the Public Affairs Committee should be obtained. Housing wasn't the only thing that was segregated. Schools were segregated in Washington. Until the court said they shouldn't be in the 1950s. So we had Brown versus the Board of Education, Bowling versus Sharp, which is specifically related to the federal district, ended segregation. So John Eaton, if you lived in the area and you were Black, you couldn't go to school at John Eaton. Reno School was still existing up in Tellingtown, we had to go farther away. But I found this piece from a history project that the students and teachers did at John Eaton School for their 100th anniversary back in 2011. So good on them for researching that history. In our community, I mean, it wasn't until 1962 that the Cleveland Park Citizens Association voted to allow Blacks into their membership. They had a specific clause against it. And by the way, the vote was 74 to 21. It wasn't unanimous. There was a real shift in Morris in that time period. There's a great article in the Washington Post from 1969 by Carl Bernstein. You may have heard of him. But he wrote about our neighborhood and talked about the folks who came here during the Taft era, who were very much exclusionary, and it was very forefront in their mind. And then the New Dealers came in, and they were much more progressive. And there was a lot of conflict between the Taft people and the New Deal people. And then, of course, Camelot came to Cleveland Park and made it even more progressive. So it's a fascinating article to read. I have a link to it on our group's website, Cleveland Park Smart Growth. It's not the microfiche that they saved isn't great, or I have it up here. But it's that was sort of the changing point of the neighborhood. Another story I'll tell and Larry Lawrence is here. Larry and I served together at the Cleveland Park Club, and he was his treasurer for years, and also the unofficial historian of the Cleveland Park Club. And he found this great story, great, interesting story about what happened there. So, summer of 1962, July, sweltering hot. Janet and Owen Roberts, career diplomats, are now stationed back in D.C., spent a lot of time in Africa. And friends of theirs, Cornatangs, diplomats from Ghana, are in town. And Owen Roberts brings Julius Cornatang and his 11-year-old son to the Cleveland Park Club for a swim. Nothing happened. They showed up, they went for a swim. Afterwards, all hell breaks loose. The board of the Cleveland Park Club is, what's going on? There's black people at the pool. And it's fascinating to read through sort of correspondence and the minutes that recount this episode. And it comes to light that Janet Roberts said, I'm not sure if we're allowed to bring black people to the pool, but let's do it anyway and make it sort of a test. And so she recounts this to the board later on as they're investigating the situation. There were people who, and I'll blow this up and read it to you, this is from the board minutes. Not only no written policy about colored people, he stated, it's definitely well known that it has not been the policy to admit Negroes to club activities, and that up to the recent incident, to his knowledge, no Negro had ever been admitted to a club activity. And he reminded, this is now 1962, that the 6th grade at John Eaton School came and there was one or two black students in the class, but that didn't constitute a policy allowing them to come in. So this was like, wow. Looking at this, what happened, so there was controversy, there was friction, the board turned over. Janet Roberts is now on the board of the Cleveland Park Club, and within a few years, bylaws are changed, and the new policy of admittance to the Cleveland Park Club is only geographic, so it's the boundaries of the John Eaton School area, but any adult residing within the area should be eligible for membership without regard to race, creed, or color. So 60s were a tipping point. New people were taking over, and times were changing. And I'll end where I started, which is talking about the historic district. You know, the 70s came, home rule came, things were very different in DC and also in this part of the neighborhood. The Metro came here in 1981, the Red Line, and then shortly thereafter there was the talk of developing the Park and Shop, and that catalyzed people to, and this was fast, I didn't know anything about what was being proposed there other than something was being proposed there. It turns out there was a mixed-use building that had 254 underground parking spaces. It would have offices, residences, retail, and 20% housing available for low and moderate income elderly people and others. Wasn't aware of that. But anyhow, that episode catalyzed the creation of the historic district in Cleveland Park, and then that happened in 1987, and then subsequently the commercial area was downsized. I want to leave time for a discussion, so my history sort of ends 40 years ago. Things haven't changed much since. But I guess this history, it wasn't written in brochures. It wasn't in the historic district nomination that talks about, you know, why this place is special. Up until a few years ago, it was on my radar, and likely not on many other people's radar. But it is every bit the story of the neighborhood, just as the stories that we are more familiar with. I'm an amateur historian at best, but I do know there's really good work being done here. I know Neil Flanagan, the historian I mentioned, is close to completing his book, and I can't wait for it. Historic Chevy Chase, DC, had a great presentation down at the DC History Center at a conference, last month. talking about the story of Chevy Chase, about the families that were evicted at Broad Branch. And so, and Carl Landowski, who's the head of historic Chevy Chase DC, said, it's like, why are we doing this? And for him, it was, you know, we can't really look forward till we understand how we got to where we are and understand the history and the full history. So I thought that was an interesting take. So Patty, I don't know if you want to, I'll pause here and sort of go into our question. And really what we want to focus on is, you know, how does this history speak to you?
And what we ask you to do is just raise your hand. I do ask that you wait for the mic. A lot of people think they can project, but trust me, I'm in a hearing impaired family, and you can't.
Stand up.
Okay, so if you could stand up and use the mic, I'd really appreciate it.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting, and I want. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And The Color of Law, I definitely want to recommend that book to you. It's fantastic. It really shows how the government has played a role in increasing segregation. I'd love to hear you or anybody else maybe in the audience, if you're not sure, about modern day, that even when these kinds of, this kind of discrimination is illegal, what are the more subtle kinds of factors that are still in play today?
Well, I would just I would just say there was a story maybe a year ago for an apartment building that was up on Wisconsin and Lowell that got cited by the Attorney General's office for not renting, accepting voucher recipients. So that is, you know, something where they got caught breaking the law, but that is probably happening in other places.
Well, thank you very much. I have heard several talks on this subject by Smart Growth and others, and I know you're a member of Smart Growth, but I have heard this information presented several times before, and I'm wondering why you're presenting it again now, and whether it's connected somehow to the government's plans to build new housing with private developers up and down Connecticut Avenue and Wisconsin Avenue, and very few of them will be able to include African Americans whose income is limited, seniors whose incomes are limited, and so forth. So the government in many cases is selling developers the land for $1 to get them to be incentivized to build. And you know, the policy is called IZ, inclusionary zoning, and it means that only 8% of the units in most of these buildings and in most of the newer buildings that have been constructed can go to people who really need help with housing. I will also just mention that according to the latest census, Ward 3, that's us, Rock Creek West, has the highest increase in the number of Black people moving into the area. So, I mean, I think things are kind of evening out. I think more should be done much more by the government and by groups like Smart Growth in terms of what they do and don't support.
Other comments?
Well, just briefly, I think I went through why I was on this journey to recount this history, and absolutely I do support densifying our area. A couple factual things: if density does come to Cleveland Park, it's going to come, there is no publicly owned land here, other than this building, which is already been developed and has no housing on it. But it will require, if they take advantage of increased density, 20% under the IC Plus program. That's better than zero housing that's currently on top of our retail stores. So, I mean, yeah, but this whole thing was not on my radar screen until a few years ago, and it's an interesting story. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk tonight. It was really eye-opening. I have a question about something you said early on. You mentioned that in Tenleytown, basically all of the black people were removed by the government. Just curious when that happened.
I believe it was like early 1930s. We had a talk on them on Rio City.
Last week.
In the 20s and 30s.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a city paper article by Neil Flanagan. Google Neil Flanagan Rio City, and it's a fascinating read.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, you just surprised me because I thought by the end of your presentation that you really successfully made the case that IZ, as the district's primary tool for building affordable housing, is totally inadequate, because if that is our only tool, and we have 80%, new construction is 80% market rate, 20% affordable, we're perpetuating or increasing racial, primarily not necessarily racial, but economic inequity. And what solutions do you have in land or subsidies that the city might use so that we are not perpetuating economic inequities?
Yeah, I don't have all the solutions, but I will say IZ Plus is a piece. It's a small piece, and we need. If we really want deeply affordable housing, it's something that we as taxpayers have to pay for. And so there's a budget process going on right now. There wasn't a lot of money put into the Housing Production Trust Fund, as there was in years past when COVID stimulus gave us hundreds of millions of dollars to put into it.
Slashed by 40%.
Yeah, so that is an issue to deal with the council and the mayor.
But beyond IZ.
That's what I'm talking about. So subsidized housing. So basically tax credits, the money in the Housing Production Trust Fund. I know Karen's talked a lot about social housing.
But that gives us 80%.
What's that?
Those three give us 80%. So how can we get more?
Yeah, well, I think you need to talk to an expert on that, because I was just talking about the history of Cleveland Park here.
Thank you.
I want to use the microphone. Thanks so much, Bob. I won't ask any questions about IZ, but, and I have a couple. So the first thing is, what's the end of the journey? You're an amateur historian. There are other elements to the story too, so that when the covenants began to be removed, I'm really curious, because I know in other cities it's been documented that the banking system itself wouldn't actually provide any loans to people of color, even in those certain areas, even after these restrictive covenants had been removed. So as you continue your journey, that would be something I'd love to hear more about. That's a really interesting aspect. And just as far as what does this history speak to me, I'm actually surprised that there's a discussion about a lot of the IZ issues. It's really surprising to me that of all these elements of history, that folks are getting into the inadequacies of there potentially being new building along Connecticut Avenue. I live up in the Chevy Chase area where there's a big hullabaloo about building something that is on city property, the one spot on Connecticut Avenue. So the way this history speaks to me is that I'm actually still embarrassed to live in this part of town where I actually have to see people who are my neighbors who are continue to be against there being new building. So that's how this history speaks to me. Thanks.
Well, to those who started this project, congratulations. After 400 years of discrimination, we all have a lot to think about and work toward. But one of the things we don't have to work toward is providing public value for private profit by developers. And if the Chevy Chase example is anything, it's that horrendous building in the 5,000 block of Connecticut Avenue, I'm not going to remember the number, where 219 units of an albatross were built on a corner with rents in the 4,000 to 5,000, of which 19 of 240 units are so-called affordable. And you want to know what they're affordable to? They're all one-bedroom studio apartments. So they say that they're available to people with families up to 3. If they make 80% of their median income in the city, which is $100,000. So if you're making $100,000, you're married and you have a baby, you can maybe get one of these IZ units. In return for which you can buy coffee at the coffee bar downstairs, folks, maybe it's free, and other amenities. So I think as we're thinking about what is the right, I'm going to use a controversial word, reparation, what is the right action given the de jure government experience of the New Deal deciding to make it really impossible for blacks to find housing in the 1930s, and almost impossible to build public housing in the 1930s. And that all having a tail that we're all still seeing wag today. I think we have to be thinking really hard in Chevy Chase and elsewhere. Where does the public value go? Does it go to least efficient production program for affordable housing that's ever been invented? Or does it go to social housing for something that is equivalent?
Hello, my name is Deirdre Brown. I'm a Ward 3 resident. Also been in the real estate industry for over 20-some years now. Own a title company. To answer your question, how does this history speak to me? It speaks to me that things have not changed. You stopped way too soon in your presentation. When you look around Ward 3, you look around this room, it is clear that we have a racial and economic inequity issue in the ward. The question becomes, and what you're kind of hearing in the room, I think, and what you've probably been hearing, is how do you fix that? And it's coming down to huge arguments over more development or not, with the idea being that if you have more development, that you're going to have more affordable housing. But unfortunately, we know that that's not the case. And you can look around the city, you can look down at the wharf, you can look at other development. When you bring it in, like this young lady here said, 200 units, only 19 are affordable, and they're one income level, right? So we really need to take a bigger look at how this new development will increase property values, increase rent, and continue to push out not only African Americans, but also people of certain income levels. Because what the developers are doing is building for the top, right? And putting the minimum amount of affordable housing. So we have to do a better job as a community of speaking out and talking to elected officials in our community advocacy groups about how we're going to push for development that actually serves the community and not just that 1% at the top.
6.5 years ago, I participated in several CPCA meetings where we were presented with the idea that we needed our problem in Cleveland Park, especially in the commercial district, was that we needed more foot traffic. So they developers wanted to save the facades on Cleveland Park, in Cleveland Park on Connecticut Avenue, and put up taller office buildings so that there would be foot traffic at lunchtime and the shops would benefit. Even though at the time, farther up Connecticut Avenue, there was the ComSat, hundreds of thousands of square feet that were standing vacant. And then we had COVID, and suddenly we all realized that we don't need a bunch more office buildings or offices, facilities. And so now it's going to be these high rises in Cleveland Park are going to be housing. And 20% will be for affordable housing. I'm skeptical. I think the money is talking, and the money wants to have Disneyland facades in our commercial district and tear up our historic district. I think the idea of converting garages. I have a daughter and a son-in-law with 3 children who live in San Francisco in a 450 square foot apartment. It's pretty small, but they seem to be happy there, and the children are thriving. I think a lot of apartments or garages could be made into I'd be willing to consider it myself. But what I'm skeptical of is when developers come along and say they're going to solve a housing problem, and last time it was foot traffic during the day, and I'm afraid I'm not buying it. I don't think they have our interests.
Thanks. I'm curious about, as we think about history speaks to you, in my case, I'm curious about what have the district done, or RANC, if it's even possible, to go back and look at where those restrictive covenants and clauses are still on the books. Has there been any actions taken to actually expunge all of that, actually document, we're going to get rid of these things, this is how we're going to do it, and do it ideally citywide, but certainly as a department?
Yeah, good question. There is actually a bill in the council right now that Matt Freeman has offered to make it easy to expunge those racially restricted covenants from your deed if your deed has one. I don't think the council's taken action on it yet, but it's in the works. And I'm not sure if it's citywide or if it just applies to this part of DC.
Citywide.
Yeah. Okay.
They had a hearing on it a few weeks ago.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Chris. I live in one of those co-ops up on Border Street 106, and we bought a house for $350,000 last year, so a bit cheaper than what these were available here. That's still really expensive. When I think about how does history speak to you, I think I feel both very fortunate, but also like I've kind of cheated somehow, and I live in Cleveland Park for not the amount of money that most people have to pay to live here. And it feels like a wonderful place to be, but it also just feels a little bit dirty, the fact that not many people can move in, and the fact that you cannot build the building I live in now seems confusing and problematic to me. So that's what I see.
What a wonderful job you've done with your presentation to bring up the history of the
this community. I have lived in this area for 36 years. So I've been around a bit, and I will just say that when people mention the word affordable housing, it's a cover story for acceptable inequality. And the reason for that is we're not talking about the wealth of this community that comes from ownership. How many people of color and others own in Cleveland Park, Forest Hills? The ownership opportunity is something that the government can support and foster. And given the color of racial discrimination in Richard Wostein's book, we should be using government resources to support ownership, not vouchers. Nothing wrong with vouchers, but ownership should be a top priority. And to the extent it isn't, it is a continuation of inequality. So the history speaks to me that ownership has to be distributed widely, because the exclusion certainly was widely distributed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for your reference. I just wanted to comment on something an astute comment earlier about excess ADUs, accessory dwelling units. I think just in Cleveland Park alone, we could have hundreds of these. And instead, like our house, we have a perfectly great basement. We always gate it as part of the labor agreement to our au pairs, but we can't rent it out because we need a business license. To get a business license, you need a certificate of occupancy, which is a huge hassle, and we wouldn't get one anyway because our ceiling is a few inches too low. I mean, to me, it's just they talk a great talk about affordable housing, but no one really. I feel like it's just bureaucrats downtown who care about licensing and making sure they get the money from those licenses for their jobs, and they don't really care about more affordable housing. If they did, they would make it easier for people like us to rent out our places.
My name is Brian. I also live here on Macomb, but in the apartment building that I rent. I came here from Chicago, and what this sort of makes me think of is that when I lived in Chicago on the north side, I lived on the south side, two different places. My partner still lives there. And like one of the strange trends, I guess, right now, it's like Chicago, it's like this is just an unbelievably affordable city, which is just like crazy to come here and see the home prices. Like my partner bought a place for $250,000. It's 4 bedrooms. It's crazy. But so there is massive population growth on the north side, which is mostly white. There is any population on the south side, which is mostly white. And the north side, not dissimilar to Cleveland Park, has lots of neighborhoods that were explicitly or implicitly racially restrictive, chose not to build housing, and now are continuing to choose not to build housing by many of the same arguments that others discussed tonight. The perfect becomes the good, and no housing has been built. And so now what's happening is is that the depopulating south side, where many of the black families can't afford to live there, they are affordable to the white families who are now being priced out of the north side. So when I think about Cleveland Park and the refusal to build housing here, lots of housing, it's we're this big balloon, and we keep a vice grip on the housing supply here, but the balloon is still expanding. So it's not only can people afford to live here, it's can people afford to live on H Street, where all the people who I know who are my age who are buying, they're buying on H Street. They're buying and driving black families out of the neighborhood there for affordability reasons. And it's not going to stop there, it's going to be in the other wards. So I think we need to think a little more broadly. This is about our neighborhood and our history for sure, but our actions here matter for the rest of the city too.
My name is John Chellin. I have lived in Cleveland Park for over 40 years. I've been involved in almost every local neighborhood organization at one point. I found this presentation really enlightening. We definitely have to focus on the terrible things in our history. But I really am uncomfortable with the illusion, the broad smear on some of the things that you portray, because I think it's unfair. I have been funded by HUD, by the leading foundations, to analyze HMDA data, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, that is there to document redlining. My work with some of the leading housing organizations forced Chairman Greenspan of the Federal Reserve to admit there was redlining. We felt vindicated in the level of effort we put in. The question is, though, how do you respond to these factors? It's easy to say that the federal government caused these things, but in my experience, the government never does anything without a powerful constituency forcing it to take those steps. Who was behind government policy? Who made money? It wasn't the average person. When we look at a person buying a condo, we want to preserve our value. Over 40 years, I've watched second-rate houses turn into first-rate houses. People who had plastic countertops now have marble. They put money in because they want to protect their neighborhood. They want their families to have a good life. I just am troubled by watching people arrogate to themselves social interests for their own financial benefit. I've watched over 20 years, argument upon argument being thrown out to justify additional density. Oh, we need it for efficiency of land use. Oh, we need it for metro-oriented development. And they get slapped down. Now in another desperate effort to take George Floyd and put that on the front page to justify density, I find this really repellent.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think what this means to me, and if you think about the facts and the history, and facts and history in different ways, but they when you really drill into what it is with the data, right, you remove kind of opinion. And I think when you open yourselves up to facts and data, you really do get an insight into things that kind of strip away your past and strip away things that may add bias to you and yourself. So first, I appreciate the data, I appreciate the facts, and I appreciate what it does to put you potentially in an uncomfortable situation to start to reconcile the past. And if you think about that, you as a citizen, what you can do to leave a better place, to improve your surroundings and things like that. And for me, maybe as someone who's maybe beginning his journey in this area, you know, it's not one thing, right? It's many things, and it's things maybe that aren't heard yet, but it's citizenry and people who need to drive this, and it's not okay to just say the government is this or the past is that. People have to take a stand, and there have to be multiple solutions. And at the end of the day, we need to fix the demand problem and put a lot more inventory into the area. And that's not just a Cleveland Park thing, that's not just a Washington DC thing, but it's a problem in most urban areas of the United States. And we today, with knowledge of the history, can deem ourselves never to repeat it again, and we can move forward and drive as much change as we can in as many areas as we can, and not just leave it up to one area. So thank you, Bob, for the invitation.
I worked with the group that put this exhibit together, and we talked to a lot of different groups. One of them was the National Association of Realtors. And we were there in the middle of 2021. They were scrambling to respond to an article, and this gets at what's happening now. They were scrambling to respond to an article that was published in Newsday about Long Island brokers, and I'll just read you a couple of quotes out of that. So I'll read you a couple of quotes out of that article. I can find them here. But the 3-year probe strongly indicates that house hunting in one of the nation's most segregated suburbs poses a substantial risk of discrimination, with black buyers chancing disadvantages almost half the time they enlist brokers. Additionally, investigation reveals that Long Island's dominant residential brokering firms help solidify racial separations. They frequently directed white customers towards areas with the highest white representation and minority buyers to more integrated neighborhoods. They also avoided business in communities with overwhelming minority populations. Now, I'm not picking on the real estate industry. The real estate industry, I think, reflects society, but this is something happening now. Actually, in the course of the 3 weeks that the exhibit has been up, I've had 3 different people of color come up to me and say that they felt they had been steered by real estate agents. So discrimination is something occurring now.
I just had a slightly different reflection. I'm a member of the Cleveland Park United Congregational Church that we showed the picture of, and thinking about how this history, and a couple of members were here as well, thinking about how this history speaks to me, I thought about how much history can change and how much institutions can change, because you brought that picture up noting that I mean, obviously wasn't a member back then, but that the church was a part of the problem 100 years ago, and I was very heartened to hear you then say, like, oh, and they're one of the groups that's actually doing really good work on this, and we're not a perfect church, no group is perfect, but we did do reckoning with ourselves. We adopted a racial justice covenant, and we are in the work, even though we had to look at really uncomfortable facets of our history. So it made me think about how much institutions can change and people can change, because to this person's point, like, it's just a church, it's just a small group of people, and we really took it upon ourselves, and many members that have been there longer than I took it upon themselves to think about this and change the trajectory of the organization. So, we can change the history of the neighborhood.
Hi, this isn't really about redlining, but I think it is about equity. I've heard a couple things that really disturb me, like we should have more basement apartments, and we should renovate garages. And I just wonder how many people here live in basement apartments or garages, and you don't want the city to have rules about how high the ceiling has to be, because I'm sorry to say it, but homeowners will do generally the least they can to fix up a basement apartment and still rent it. And, say, sorry, isn't it great you have something you can rent here? You don't have to pay a high rent in a building. I mean, I just hope people will think about it. And do we really want people to be in little tiny apartments? Because, hey, look, you have an apartment.
just think about it. Where do you want to live?
I don't live in Cleveland Park, I live in AU Park. And in near Tenleytown, I go to St. Columbus Church, and I've done a lot of research, and some of this is displayed here into, how St. Columbus participated in the destruction of the Reno community and abandoned its own mission church for African Americans there, and then took all the money, most of the money anyway, from the condemnation to pay down some of St. Columbus debt on that nice stone chapel where the congregation worships today. And that started me on this journey. What I have learned, and Deirdre Brown and I have both recently testified in budget hearings on housing issues. I know Gail has done that too. It is hard stuff. There are a million different little housing programs in this city. And I think everyone here is very, perplexed about, well, what should we do? How do we go about fixing this problem? IZ doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's basically, as someone said here, continuing this kind of almost economic apartheid in this city. And really, most people who really need housing can't afford IZ apartments anyway. We're abandoning public housing. I mean, it's falling apart. The city is not fixing it up. The Hub report really hasn't made very much of a difference in how DC government is behaving. So what I would urge everyone to do is really start to learn this stuff. What are these programs? What is the Housing Production Trust Fund? What does DCHA do? What do all these different programs actually do? And are they being funded adequately? And, which they are not, I will tell you. So that's where I think we need to go. And I think, if anything, this program of, Undesign the Red Line, which I think I'm so proud that we were part of it here from St. Columbus, is to urge everyone to become really literate on these issues. It's hard. It takes a long time to learn.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, but it's 7:30. I want to thank all of you for coming, for your honesty, your sharing. I want to thank Bob for his wonderful presentation. If interested you and you're wanting to talk more about potential solutions, we're having a panel called Undesign the Red Line on June the 6th, which has people from the area who have worked to implement some of these solutions and what they've learned. So check our website, undesigndc.org. June 4th. Sorry, June 4th. Thank you. Have a safe trip home.
You want to thank him, Bob? If you want to go, then thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Thank you. What did you, my son Connor, who testified before the other night.
you were the one. Okay. I was gonna say, are you really? I thought
he was upstairs.
Yeah.
He wrote it all himself. He's
wow. Yeah, you were great. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. So, how was you been?
We were in Holland and France, Paris, and